Have you ever wondered what the very first bite of cooked food in human history actually tasted like? And whether the person eating it had any idea that it would eventually reshape the entire human brain? You have probably never thought about this, because cooked food is so ordinary to you that it barely registers as a technology at all. You wake up, you heat something, you eat it, and you move on with your day without a second thought. But somewhere in the deep past, one of your ancestors did something that no animal on Earth had ever done before. They took raw food, exposed it to fire, and ate it anyway. And that single decision, repeated over and over, across hundreds of thousands of years, may be the reason you are capable of reading these words right now. To understand why this moment matters so much, you have to first understand what your ancestors' bodies were dealing with before cooking existed. For millions of years, early hominins ate the way every other primate on the planet ate. They chewed raw plants, raw tubers, raw meat when they could get it, and whatever else the landscape offered. And raw food, it turns out, is expensive. Not expensive in money, but expensive in time, in energy, and in the sheer physical effort of breaking it down. Think about the last time you tried to eat something tough and fibrous raw, like a raw sweet potato or a raw piece of meat. Your jaw would ache. Your teeth would struggle, and even after all that effort, your gut would still need to work overtime to extract the nutrients locked inside those tough plant cells and dense muscle fibers. Early hominins spent hours of every single day doing exactly this. Some estimates suggest that a chimpanzee, which eats a diet fairly similar to what early hominins likely ate, spends nearly half of its waking hours just chewing. Half. Imagine spending 6, 7, 8 hours a day with your jaw working non-stop just to get enough calories to survive until tomorrow. So here is the first question worth sitting with. If chewing raw food took up so much of the day, when did that change? And what happened to free up all of that lost time? Before answering that, it helps to picture just how long your ancestors lived this way before anything changed at all. Early hominins like Australopithecus, the small-brained ape-like ancestors that came several million years before you, spent an enormous stretch of evolutionary time locked into this exact raw food routine, with heavy jaws, wide flaring rib cages built to house a large gut, and brains not much larger than a modern chimpanzee's. For millions of years, this was simply what it meant to be a hominin. Nothing about the daily rhythm of eating had changed in any fundamental way. And then, relatively suddenly in evolutionary terms, something shifted. The answer to that question is where things get genuinely fascinating, and where you need to hold on to some patience, because the full answer does not come quickly. It comes in layers, the same way the evidence itself was uncovered in layers, quite literally, buried in the dirt of caves and riverbanks across the world. Let's start with what your body actually needed millions of years ago, before there was any fire at all. Early hominins, the ancestors of modern humans, had large jaws, large teeth, and a large gut. This makes complete sense if you think about it as an engineering problem. If your food is raw and tough, you need bigger, stronger tools to break it down, both in your mouth and in your digestive system. A bigger gut means more surface area, and more time for digestion to extract every last calorie from difficult raw material. It is a body built entirely around the demands of raw food. But something strange happens in the fossil record starting around 2 million years ago. A new species appears, known as Homo erectus, and its body looks noticeably different from what came before. The jaw is smaller, the teeth are smaller, and most strikingly, the gut appears to have shrunk as well, based on the shape of the rib cage and pelvis in fossil specimens. At the very same time, something else is growing: the brain. This is where you need to understand just how expensive a brain actually is to run. Your brain, right now, sitting in your skull, makes up only about 2% of your total body weight. But it consumes roughly 20% of your body's total energy at rest. 20% from just 2% of your mass. That is an enormous metabolic cost, and evolution does not hand out expensive upgrades for free. If early hominins were investing more and more energy into growing bigger brains, that energy had to come from somewhere else in the body's budget. This is exactly the puzzle that anthropologist Leslie Aiello and physiologist Peter Wheeler tackled in the 1990s, when they proposed what has become known as the expensive tissue hypothesis. Their argument was that the gut and the brain are both extremely costly organs to maintain, and that a body generally cannot afford to enlarge both at the same time without some kind of trade-off elsewhere. Their idea was that as hominin diets shifted toward more energy-dense foods, the gut could afford to shrink, and that freed-up energy budget could then be redirected toward growing a larger brain. It was a groundbreaking way of thinking about the numbers behind evolution, treating the body almost like a budget with a fixed amount of energy to distribute. But this raises the next open question, and it is a big one. What kind of dietary shift could possibly be dramatic enough to shrink the gut and grow the brain at the same time? Simply eating more raw meat does not fully explain it, because raw meat, while calorie-dense, is still tough, still requires significant chewing, and still places real digestive demands on the body. Something else had to change. Something had to make food itself easier to break down, easier to digest, and more efficient at delivering energy. This is where fire enters the story, and this is where one researcher in particular has spent much of his career building a case that will completely change the way you think about your evening meal. Primatologist Richard Wrangham, in his influential work often summarized under what is now called the cooking hypothesis, argued that the dietary shift Aiello and Wheeler were describing was cooking itself. Wrangham's central claim is bold. He suggests that cooked food was not simply a convenience that came along much later in human history, as many people assume, but was in fact the very fuel that powered the growth of the human brain, arriving as early as the emergence of Homo erectus nearly 2 million years ago. Here is the logic behind Wrangham's argument, and it is worth walking through slowly, because it is genuinely elegant. Cooking does something remarkable to food at a molecular level. Heat breaks down tough plant cell walls, unlocking starches and nutrients that would otherwise pass through the digestive system largely unused. Heat also denatures proteins in meat, unraveling their tightly wound structure so that digestive enzymes can access and break them down far more efficiently. In both cases, cooking essentially performs a portion of digestion before the food ever reaches your stomach. Your body, in a very real sense, outsources part of its digestive workload to the fire. This means cooked food delivers significantly more usable calories per bite than the same food eaten raw, and it does so while requiring far less chewing and far less energy spent on digestion. Suddenly, that expensive equation Aiello and Wheeler were grappling with has an answer. A smaller gut becomes viable, not because the body is eating less, but because the food itself has become easier to process. And the energy that used to be spent on grinding through raw fiber and muscle can now be redirected toward the brain's enormous appetite for fuel. You might be wondering, though, whether there is any direct physical proof for this, something beyond just a compelling theory. This is where the story moves out of the realm of biology and into archaeology, into actual dirt, ash, and burned bone dug out of the ground. One of the most important pieces of physical evidence comes from Wonderwork Cave in South Africa. Researcher Francesco Berna and his colleagues examined sediment layers deep inside this cave and found microscopic traces of burned bone fragments and ash, dated to approximately 1 million years ago. What made this discovery so significant was not just the presence of burned material, but where it was found. The burning was deep inside the cave, far from the entrance, in a location where a naturally occurring wildfire would have had almost no way to reach. This strongly suggested that the fire was being carried inside and controlled deliberately, rather than being an accidental, uncontrolled blaze that happened to sweep through the area. This is one of the earliest strong pieces of evidence anywhere in the world for controlled fire use by early humans. But if fire use goes back 1 million years, was it something people did constantly? Or something rare and occasional, more like a lucky accident than a daily habit? This is another question worth holding on to, because the answer changes how you should picture your ancestors' everyday lives. For this, archaeologists look to a site called Gesher Benot Yaakov in Israel, studied extensively by researcher Naama Goren Inbar and her team. At this site, dated to roughly 790,000 years ago, researchers found clusters of burned flint tools and wood concentrated in specific spots, rather than scattered randomly across the site. This clustering pattern is a strong signal of repeated, habitual fire use in the same locations over time, essentially the deep time equivalent of a campfire pit that gets reused night after night. This was not a single lucky spark. This was a pattern, a routine, something your ancestors were doing again and again as part of ordinary life. Now picture this for a moment. Imagine one of your ancestors, hundreds of thousands of years before recorded history, returning to the same patch of ground, evening after evening, tending a small fire, using it not just for warmth, but for transforming the raw food gathered that day into something softer, easier to eat, and more filling. This was not a special occasion. This was becoming, quite literally, dinner. Of course, not every researcher agrees on exactly when this behavior became widespread, and this disagreement is worth understanding honestly rather than glossing over. Archaeologists Will Robrooks and Paola Villa conducted an extensive review of fire evidence across European sites and concluded that truly widespread, habitual fire use does not become clearly and consistently visible in the archaeological record until around 300 to 400,000 years ago. Before that point, the evidence tends to be scattered, site-specific, and open to some interpretation, exactly like the debate over Wonderwork Cave and Gesher Benot Yaakov. So here is where the honest, nuanced answer sits. The idea that cooking could go back nearly 2 million years, right alongside the emergence of Homo erectus, is a compelling and biologically elegant hypothesis, strongly supported by the anatomical evidence of smaller guts, smaller teeth, and larger brains. But the physical, undeniable evidence of fire use, the actual burned bone and ash in the ground, becomes truly widespread and consistent later, somewhere in the range of 300 to 800,000 years ago, depending on which site and which researcher you ask. Real science often looks like this. Not a single dramatic date circled on a calendar, but a gradual tightening of the evidence from multiple directions until a clearer picture emerges. If you are enjoying learning about how your ancestors actually lived and what shaped the body and brain you carry around every single day, this is a good moment to tap like and subscribe, because it genuinely helps more of this reach people who are curious about the same things you are. Now let's get back to the fire, because there is still a lot more to uncover about what cooking actually did to the human body once it became a permanent part of daily life. One of the most compelling pieces of modern evidence for just how much cooking changed the human body comes from an experimental study conducted by researcher Catherine Zink and her colleague Daniel Lieberman. Rather than digging through ancient sediment, they took a more direct approach. They gave modern human volunteers raw meat and raw vegetables to chew, and separately gave them the same foods cooked, then carefully measured the muscular effort required to chew each version using electromyography, a technique that measures electrical activity in muscles as they work. What they found was striking. Cooked meat required dramatically less chewing effort than raw meat, and this effect was even more pronounced than the difference produced by simply slicing raw meat into smaller pieces with a stone tool. In other words, cooking alone, separate from any tool use, delivered a massive reduction in the physical work required to eat. This finding matters enormously for the bigger picture, because it means cooking was not just marginally helpful. It fundamentally changed the mechanical relationship between your ancestors and their food. Fewer hours spent chewing meant fewer hours dedicated purely to survival maintenance, and that time had to go somewhere. Some of it likely went toward the increasingly complex social behaviors that come with larger brains, things like extended parental care, tool innovation, and more elaborate group cooperation. This brings up another question worth sitting with. If cooking freed up so much time and energy, how exactly did that translate into a bigger brain, biologically speaking? It is one thing to say energy was freed up, but how does freed up energy actually build new brain tissue? This is where the work of researcher Karina Fonseca Azevedo and her colleague Susana Herculano Huzel becomes essential to understanding the full picture. Herculano Huzel developed a method for counting the actual number of neurons in mammalian brains, rather than simply measuring brain size or volume, which had been the standard approach for decades. Her research revealed that the human brain contains an extraordinarily high number of neurons for its size, roughly 86 billion, achieved in a way that would be metabolically impossible on a raw food diet alone. based on careful calculations of how many calories a primate could realistically gather and process in a single day while eating unprocessed raw food. Her modeling suggested that a great ape with a brain the size of a modern human's, if it were forced to survive on a raw diet, would need to spend an unrealistic number of hours every single day just eating in order to gather enough calories to support that brain. Something had to change the caloric math, and cooking is the most plausible candidate, because it dramatically increases the calories extracted per hour of eating. Now picture the full chain of events coming together. Your ancestors begin using fire in a controlled, repeated way. That fire transforms raw food into cooked food, unlocking far more usable calories per bite. Chewing time drops dramatically, digestive effort drops dramatically, and the gut can afford to shrink slightly because it no longer needs to work as hard to extract nutrients from tough raw material. The energy that used to be spent on digestion and chewing becomes available for other uses, and the brain, being the most metabolically hungry organ in the entire body, is perfectly positioned to absorb that newly available energy and grow larger over evolutionary time. But you might be asking yourself something else entirely at this point. If cooking was such an obvious advantage, why did it take so long for humans to fully control fire? Why not immediately, the very first time a hominin encountered a wildfire? The answer to this lies in just how difficult and dangerous fire actually is to control without any modern tools or knowledge. Wildfires happen naturally, caused by lightning strikes, and early hominins almost certainly encountered them long before they ever learned to create or sustain fire deliberately. The real leap was not discovering that fire existed. It was figuring out how to keep a fire burning without letting it consume everything around it, how to transport a flame from one location to another, how to protect it from rain and wind, and eventually, how to create fire on demand rather than simply waiting to capture a naturally occurring flame. This is an enormous cognitive and practical challenge, and it likely required years of trial, observation, and social learning passed down between individuals and across generations before it became a reliable, everyday skill. This is actually part of why the archaeological evidence looks so gradual and scattered across hundreds of thousands of years, rather than appearing as a single sudden invention. Early fire use was probably opportunistic. Your ancestors likely captured flames from natural fires, kept them alive as long as possible using whatever fuel was on hand, and only gradually developed more reliable methods for creating and maintaining fire independently. It was not a single eureka moment. It was closer to a slow, hard-won mastery, built up over an almost unimaginable span of time. There is also a compelling comparative angle worth understanding here, one that comes from outside the world of human archaeology entirely. Physiologist Stephen Secor and researcher Scott Boback ran a controlled study feeding pythons meals of raw meat and cooked meat, then measuring the metabolic energy each snake spent digesting its meal. The results showed that digesting the cooked meal cost the pythons significantly less energy than digesting the raw meal, even though pythons have never used fire and never evolved alongside cooking in any way. This matters because it demonstrates that the energy-saving effect of cooking is not some special quirk unique to human biology. It is a basic physical and chemical reality of how heat alters food, one that would have applied just as powerfully to your ancestors' digestive systems as it did to a snake's, reinforcing just how universally and reliably cooking reduces the metabolic cost of extracting energy from a meal. Keeping a fire alive, however, was never going to be simple, and this is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reveals something important about how cooking may have shaped not just diet, but social structure itself. A fire needs fuel gathered and carried back to camp. It needs tending throughout the night, someone awake or half awake to feed it and keep it from dying out. It needs protection from wind and rain. None of this can realistically be handled by a single individual working alone, night after night for years on end. This means fire maintenance likely required cooperation, shared responsibility, and some degree of division of labor among group members, which ties into what researcher Robin Dunbar has described as the social brain hypothesis, the idea that much of the growth in primate brain size across evolutionary history is linked to the cognitive demands of managing increasingly complex social relationships within a group. A fire that needs to be shared, protected, and maintained by multiple people over time is not just a cooking tool. It is a small daily test of cooperation, trust, and coordination, repeated endlessly, generation after generation. Now here is a genuinely counterintuitive twist worth pausing on, something that flips the way most people instinctively think about cooking. Most people assume that cooking was primarily about safety, about killing off dangerous bacteria and parasites that might be present in raw meat. And to be fair, this is a real and meaningful benefit of cooking, and researchers do believe it played some role in why cooked food became preferred over raw food in certain contexts. But according to Wrangham's core argument, the safety benefit was not actually the primary evolutionary driver behind why cooking became so deeply embedded in human biology and behavior. The primary driver was the sheer caloric efficiency, the fact that cooked food delivers so much more usable energy per bite, in far less time, than raw food ever could. Safety was a bonus. Energy efficiency was the engine. This distinction matters more than it might initially seem, because it reframes cooking as something much more foundational than a hygiene practice. It reframes it as an energy technology, arguably the very first energy technology your ancestors ever developed, long before anything resembling agriculture, long before the wheel, long before written language. Fire, applied to food, was the original efficiency upgrade, and your entire biology was quietly reshaped around it over the course of nearly 2 million years. You might still be wondering, though, why this distinction between safety and efficiency actually matters so much to researchers studying this question. Here is the reasoning. If cooking had evolved purely as a defense against foodborne illness, you would expect the strongest evolutionary pressure to show up specifically around meat, since raw meat carries a higher risk of harmful bacteria and parasites than most raw plant foods do. But the anatomical and archaeological evidence does not point to a diet that suddenly became meat-focused the moment cooking appears. Instead, it points to a broader shift in overall caloric efficiency across the whole diet, plants included. Exactly the pattern you would expect if the primary advantage was unlocking more usable energy per bite, rather than simply avoiding illness. This is part of why Wrangham and other researchers place so much emphasis on the energy argument specifically. It fits the full pattern of evidence far more completely than the safety argument does on its own, even though both benefits were almost certainly happening at the same time, working together rather than competing with each other. It is also worth noting that this efficiency advantage would have compounded over time in a way that a simple safety benefit never could. A safety benefit prevents occasional illness, which matters, but it does not fundamentally change the daily energy budget of an entire population. A caloric efficiency benefit, by contrast, applies every single day, to every single meal, for every single member of the group, generation after generation, for hundreds of thousands of years without interruption. Small daily advantages, repeated with that kind of relentless consistency across such an enormous span of evolutionary time, are exactly the kind of pressure capable of reshaping jaws, guts, and brains at the scale researchers observe in the fossil record. This is one of the core reasons cooking stands out as such a powerful candidate explanation. Not because any single meal made a dramatic difference, but because the same small advantage repeated itself, meal after meal, for close to 2 million years. Let's dig even deeper into what this meant for the actual physical structure of your ancestors' bodies, because the changes went far beyond just brain size and gut size. Consider the jaw and teeth specifically. Earlier hominins, before this dietary shift, had large, robust jaws and correspondingly large molars, built for grinding through tough, raw plant fiber for hours at a time. As cooked food became more central to daily life, jaw size and tooth size both decreased noticeably across the fossil record. This is not a subtle change either. When you compare the skulls of earlier hominins to Homo erectus and later human ancestors, the reduction in jaw robustness and tooth size is one of the most visually obvious differences you can point to. Smaller jaws simply were not needed anymore, because cooked food required so much less mechanical processing before it could be swallowed and digested. There is also a subtler anatomical shift worth understanding, related to the shape of the ribcage and pelvis. In earlier hominins, the ribcage tends to flare outward toward the bottom, creating extra room for a large gut, similar to what you see in modern great apes like gorillas and chimpanzees. whose diets remain largely raw and require substantial digestive capacity. In Homo erectus, the rib cage becomes noticeably more cylindrical, straighter up and down, which anthropologists interpret as clear evidence of a smaller gut, requiring less internal space. This is a skeletal signature, quite literally written into the bones, of a body that no longer needed to carry around a large digestive processing plant, because so much of that processing was now happening externally, over a fire, before the food ever entered the mouth. Now think about what all of this meant for daily life itself, moment to moment, for one of your distant ancestors living hundreds of thousands of years ago. Imagine the amount of time suddenly available in a single day. Instead of spending the majority of daylight hours chewing tough raw food just to survive, cooking compressed that necessary eating time down dramatically. That freed up time had to be filled with something, and researchers believe this newly available time likely contributed to more complex social behavior. Group members could spend more time together around a shared fire, which some researchers argue may have been an early foundation for more advanced communication, cooperative planning, and social bonding, since a fire creates a natural gathering point that persists after the sun goes down, extending the useful hours of the day in a way that had never been possible before. This brings up yet another question worth exploring. If fire extended the useful hours of the day and created a natural social gathering point, could nighttime firelight itself have influenced human social and cognitive development, separate from the nutritional benefits of cooking? Researcher Polly Wiesner conducted an ethnographic study examining conversations among the Juhunsi people, a modern hunter-gatherer group in Africa whose lifestyle offers some insight into patterns that may echo deep into the past. Wiesner's research found a clear pattern. Daytime conversations tended to focus heavily on practical matters, economic complaints, and problem-solving related to immediate survival tasks. Nighttime conversations around the fire, by contrast, shifted dramatically toward storytelling, myth, humor, and social and cultural knowledge, the kind of conversation that builds shared identity and passes down cultural memory between generations. While this research is based on modern populations and cannot be directly projected backward hundreds of thousands of years with certainty, it offers a compelling window into how firelight may have created a unique social space, different from the practical daylight hours, that possibly shaped how early humans bonded, taught, and transmitted culture across generations. Picture this scene for a moment, because it connects directly back to something you still experience today, even if you have never consciously noticed the connection. A small group gathered around a fire. As the sun goes down, food already cooked and eaten, the physical work of the day mostly finished. The firelight flickers, casting long shadows, and for the first time in the entire history of that group's biology, there is genuine leisure time after dark. Time that is not consumed by chewing, not consumed by foraging, not consumed by the relentless physical demands of daylight survival. What do you think naturally fills that kind of quiet, flickering, communal space? Conversation, storytelling, laughter, the exact ingredients that build culture, memory, and social bonds strong enough to hold a group together across generations. Now here is where the modern mirror comes into sharp focus, because this pattern has never actually disappeared from your life. It has simply changed its form. Think about your own daily rhythm. Your mornings and afternoons are typically filled with practical tasks, work, errands, responsibilities, the modern equivalent of foraging and problem-solving. But your evenings tend to shift in tone, don't they? You gather with people you care about, whether that is family at a dinner table or friends around a meal, and the conversation naturally loosens, becomes more social, more personal, more about connection than about tasks. You might not have a literal fire in the center of the room anymore, but you very likely have some version of a warm, glowing gathering point, whether that is a stovetop, a dinner table with a warm meal on it, or even the soft blue glow of a screen late at night, functioning in some ways as fire once did, as the anchor point around which the day winds down and social connection takes over from practical labor. Even the specific foods you crave without thinking twice about it trace directly back to this ancient shift. Softer, cooked, energy-dense foods, the kind that require little chewing and deliver a lot of calories quickly, are exactly the foods your ancestors' bodies became optimized for over nearly 2 million years of cooking. This is part of why so many modern comfort foods are soft, warm, and calorically rich. Your brain evolved in an environment where that combination signaled efficient, valuable, brain-fueling energy, and that ancient wiring has not disappeared just because your environment has changed dramatically around it. Think about it the next time you reach for something warm and soft after a long, tiring day. A bowl of pasta, melted cheese, a fresh loaf of bread straight from the oven. That instinct is not a modern weakness or a lack of discipline. It is a nearly 2 million-year-old craving, inherited from ancestors whose survival quite literally depended on seeking out exactly this kind of easily digestible, calorie-dense food whenever it was available. Even the almost universal human preference for warm food over cold food may trace back to this same root, since warmth was historically a reliable signal that food had been properly processed by fire, and was therefore safer, softer, and more efficient to eat than something eaten cold and raw. This ancient wiring also helps explain why raw food diets, when modern humans attempt them today, are often so difficult to sustain and typically require an enormous amount of deliberate chewing and far larger portions to meet the same caloric needs that a cooked meal would satisfy in a fraction of the time. Your digestive system is, in a very real sense, still calibrated for a world where cooking does part of the work before food ever reaches your mouth. It is not a coincidence that so many people attempting strict raw diets report constant hunger and difficulty maintaining their weight. Their bodies are quietly asking for the caloric efficiency that cooking has provided for the last 2 million years of human evolutionary history. There is one more layer worth exploring here, something that connects cooking directly to an aspect of daily life you almost certainly take completely for granted, and that is the shared meal itself. Before cooking, and before the extended evening leisure time that cooking created, there was less structural reason for a group to gather at a consistent, predictable time specifically around food. Foraging and eating raw food could happen more individually, more sporadically, spread throughout the day as opportunities arose. But cooking requires a fire requires tending, and a fire naturally becomes a gathering point, precisely because it takes time to prepare food over it. Time during which people are naturally present together, waiting, watching, talking. Some researchers argue this is part of the deep origin of the shared meal, as a social institution, something that persists in nearly every human culture on Earth today, in a way that is genuinely unusual compared to most other animals, which tend to eat far more individually or opportunistically, rather than gathering around a consistent, shared eating event. Think about how deeply this pattern is still embedded in your life today. Family dinners, holiday meals, business meetings conducted over lunch, first dates built entirely around sharing a meal together. Nearly every major human social ritual involves food eaten together at a shared time, and this pattern likely traces back, at least in part, to the earliest fires your ancestors gathered around, waiting for cooked food to be ready, together, night after night, for hundreds of thousands of years. Consider how strange this would look to almost any other animal on the planet. Most predators eat quickly, often alone, and often defensively, guarding a kill from rivals rather than sharing it openly. Yet somewhere along the way, your ancestors turned the exact moment of eating into the centerpiece of social life rather than a private, guarded event. Why would that happen? Part of the answer likely comes back to fire itself. Cooking takes time. Meat does not become tender in an instant, and starchy roots do not soften the moment they touch the coals. That waiting period, minutes stretching into longer stretches as a meal slowly cooked over open flame, created a built-in window of shared idle time that simply did not exist in quite the same way for a group eating raw food scattered throughout the day. And whenever humans are given shared idle time together, something interesting tends to happen. They talk, they teach, they bond. The very act of waiting for the fire to finish its work may have quietly trained your ancestors, generation after generation, to treat mealtime as a social event rather than a purely biological one. You can also see an echo of the ancient firelit gathering in the very design of your own home right now, whether you have ever noticed it or not. Kitchens are consistently described by architects and designers as the true social center of a modern household, the place where people naturally congregate, even when there is no specific reason to be there. often described using the exact phrase, heart of the home. Ask yourself honestly how many gatherings in your own life have ended up clustering around a kitchen island or a stove, even when there was a perfectly comfortable living room only a few steps away. That pull is not accidental. It is an extremely old instinct, quietly steering you toward the place where food is being transformed by heat, exactly the way it steered your ancestors toward the fire pit, night after night, for hundreds of thousands of years. Let's return now to the deeper biological story, because there is still more nuance worth understanding about exactly how significant this shift really was. Researcher Lauren Cordain and colleagues have examined the broader question of dietary shifts in human evolution, and their work reinforces just how unusual the human digestive system is compared to other primates. Modern humans have a notably smaller gut relative to body size compared to other great apes, and a correspondingly higher quality, more energy-dense diet is required to sustain the body's needs, given that smaller digestive capacity. This lines up precisely with the expensive tissue hypothesis and with Wrangham's cooking hypothesis, forming a consistent, mutually reinforcing picture across multiple independent lines of research: anatomical, behavioral, and archaeological. This pattern was not unique to the direct ancestral line that led to modern humans either. It shows up in our closest extinct relatives as well. Researcher Amanda Henry and her colleagues examined dental calculus, the hardened plaque preserved on ancient teeth, taken from Neanderthal remains. Inside that preserved plaque, they identified microscopic starch granules that showed clear signs of having been chemically altered by heat, meaning these Neanderthals were cooking starchy plant foods, not just meat, and were doing so as a regular part of their diet tens of thousands of years ago. This tells you something important. Cooking was not a strange, isolated invention that only modern humans stumbled onto. It appears to have been a widely shared behavior across multiple different hominin lineages, further reinforcing just how central and how ancient this practice really is to the broader story of human evolution as a whole, not just to the specific branch of the family tree that led directly to you. It is worth pausing here to genuinely appreciate how remarkable it is that so many completely separate types of evidence all point toward the same underlying story. The anatomical evidence of shrinking guts, teeth, and jaws. The archaeological evidence of burned bone and ash at Wonderwerk Cave and clustered fire use at Gesher Benot Yaakov. The experimental evidence from Zink and Lieberman showing reduced chewing effort with cooked food. The neuron counting research from Herculano Huzel showing the caloric impossibility of supporting a human-sized brain on a raw diet alone. Each of these lines of evidence was developed independently, using completely different methods, by different researchers, working in different scientific disciplines, and yet they all converge on the same underlying conclusion. Cooking was not a minor convenience added late in human history. It was very likely one of the central forces that made the modern human brain possible in the first place. Now think back to the very beginning of this video, to the strange thought experiment about what it might have felt like to eat the first cooked bite of food in your entire evolutionary lineage. You now have a much richer, much more complete picture of what that moment actually represented. It was not simply a new flavor or a new texture. It was the first step in an evolutionary chain reaction that would eventually reshape the jaw, reshape the gut, reshape the rib cage, and most significantly, provide the caloric fuel necessary to grow the very brain that allows you, right now, to understand and reflect on this entire story. Take a moment now to notice just how many separate threads have quietly woven together to reach this point. A shrinking jaw, a straightening rib cage, a brain demanding an ever larger share of the body's energy budget. Ash and burned bone preserved deep inside a South African cave. Scorched flint clustered around a riverbank in the Middle East. Starch grains baked onto the teeth of a Neanderthal who lived and ate long before recorded history began. None of these clues, on its own, would be enough to tell the full story. But together, they form a picture so consistent, across so many independent scientific disciplines, that it becomes very difficult to look at a warm meal the same way ever again. And so, to finally and directly answer the question this video opened with, yes, ancient humans absolutely cooked their food, and the earliest strong physical evidence for controlled, repeated fire use stretches back somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million years, with compelling anatomical evidence suggesting the underlying shift in diet may have begun even earlier, close to 2 million years ago, right alongside the emergence of Homo erectus itself. Cooking was not simply about taste or convenience. It was almost certainly one of the essential turning points that allowed the human brain to grow into the extraordinary, energy-hungry organ it is today. And every single time you sit down to a warm meal, you are unknowingly repeating one of the oldest and most transformative habits your entire species has ever developed. A habit so old, so deeply woven into your biology, that your body would likely struggle to fully support your own brain without it.